This Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Small Bear Show. I'm your host, Alex S. Johnson, the founder of Nocturnicorn Books. We're a boutique literary imprint located in Carmichael, California. We're also co-published in Caen, France by Dean M. Drinkle, who's edited four of our books. And without further ado, we have a very, very distinguished guest, Mr. John Yamrus. As you can see from his this whatever it is behind you, it's a from a Barnes and Noble signing event. So yeah, he's somebody who's signed at Barnes and Noble, and so I don't have your bio in front of me, but like I can recall immediately as you've that Mr. Yamrus has published, at least 39 books. Among those are memoirs and uh, 4,000 poems have been published. He's extremely distinguished. He's been published everywhere. His work is taught at the university level, and he's had a more than 50-year career. So I think we're just going to kind of dive in. My first question to you is, sir, is see, when I was growing up, I was introduced to the work of writers like William Shakespeare, Chaucer, by my father, who was a student of Harold Bloom at Yale University. But it wasn't only the classics because he also introduced me to the work of Allen Ginsberg. And when I was 14 years old, he took me to the Whole Earth Festival in Sausalito, California. And there were people like Gregory Corso was running around. We had, the old hippies, the old beats. We had Wavy Gravy, the famous, Woodstock acid clown was around there, right? My dad, who's still around, he's just turned 88 years old. Happy birthday, Dad. He was a contributor to the Whole Earth Review, which was a spinoff from the Whole Earth catalog. And so he was in on the ground floor of publishing alongside people like Robert Crumb, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Kathy Acker, and all these people. So my question to you is because I was introduced to all these great authors, and he took me to see to the Whole Earth Festival in Sausalito, and he said, you have to see Ginsberg. You have to experience Ginsberg for yourself because this is the man who revolutionized American poetry. He changed the way we looked at verse, and he was arguably one of the greatest poets since in the Whitmanic tradition since Whitman, and he was mentored by William Carlos Williams. And when he read Ginsberg read Plutonian Ode for the first time ever. There was the debut of Plutonian Ode. I was so blown away that I think then and there I thought, this is rock and roll. This is isn't just poetry. This isn't like sedate kind of verse, or this isn't like the open mic where, you go down to your local coffee shop and people, do some doggerel verse, to-dum, 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 to-dum. This is more like the ancient bards preparing for battle, right? And they would get out there and they would like, because I have Nordic ancestry and I have Scots ancestry, and I can just only imagine, right, the Celtic bards coming up before they go to war, right? The very first warriors saying, we're going to declaim some poetry. We're not going to just read some poetry, very polite verse, or I feel really depressed today. I think I'll commit suicide, I'm going to slit my wrist with these razor blades. This is more like a thunderstorm rolled in, and I was within a foot of the stage where Ginsberg was standing there. This is the man who wrote Howl, right? I'd read Howl, and so I was wondering what I know you're a big fan of Kerouac and also Corso as am I. So was there any one particular author who whose work was so impressive to you that you said, I want to do whatever they are doing, he or she is doing. I want to do that.
Well, getting back to what you say, hey, and let me take two steps back. You
Sure.
talked about Harold Bloom.
Yes,
Harold Bloom wrote a very famous introduction to Marcel Proust's Remembrance of Things Past,
that he
or
did.
as is commonly known now, In Search of Lost Time.
Yes.
Uh, so we have a connection there with Harold Bloom. But getting back to Ginsberg, um, his poetry is subversive in the classic sense of the word. It's in your face. It's warlike. It's just really interesting. And that whole crowd. Now, I came on the scene. Those guys were already on their way out. I came on the scene shortly after that. I started publishing right around 1970. And so I've been publishing for 55 years now. I'm 74. My first book came out in 1970. Uh, in fact, when you and I spoke yesterday, I told you the story of how I got my foot in the door as a writer. And if you don't mind, maybe I'll
Oh,
tell that story
I'd
again to
love to hear
people
that again. Yeah.
who haven't heard it. And this is a true story, and it means a lot to me for so many reasons. But going back to around 1969, 1970, my friend Rick and I both wanted to be writers in the worst way. Uh, I guess in some way I did turn out to be a writer in the worst way, but that's another story. Uh, in, in in any case, Rick and I, we would get together and drink pop-off vodka. And as I said yesterday, pop-off vodka at that time was probably $5 a bottle. Came with a little sombrero, a little plastic sombrero for a cap. And, had to be about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, and we were both complaining about the fact that we'd send off to magazines, and typically they'd write back and say, well, you know, where have you been published? What awards have you won? And of course, the answer is nowhere and nothing. So that night, again, it's a true story. My friend Rick and I finished this bottle of vodka. We were at the corner of Oliver and Wakefield Streets. He finished the bottle, threw the sombrero to the side of the street, looked up at the street sign, looked up and saw Wakefield Street, and said, John, I hereby award you the Wakefield Prize. I took the bottle, I walked home. The next morning, I rode off to a rather well known at the time magazine, poetry magazine out of Chicago. And a couple of weeks later, I was going to say email. I got a piece of mail, a letter from the editor saying, yes, John, I heard about you recently winning the prestigious Wakefield Prize. I'd very much like to publish your work. So that's how I got my foot in the door. My whole career began with a lie, and I've been telling lies ever since. So, and you were kind enough to say that I've had almost 4,000 poems published in magazines and anthologies, and I'm happy to say yesterday morning I learned that my I'll have a fourth book coming out in
Oh,
translation in Europe
Congratulations.
later this year. So that'll be my fourth book to come out in translation.
Wow.
So I'm really excited to
Wow,
share that with you.
congratulations. What's the name of the book and what language is it translated in?
It'll be coming out in Albanian.
Oh, wow, Albanian. So,
Yes.
John Belushi,
And
wasn't John
the
Belushi in Albania?
translator, his name is Fadil Bajraj,
Okay.
and Fadil has translated the likes of Kerouac, Ginsberg,
Oh, wow.
Corso, Ferlinghetti. He's translated books by Bukowski, uh, Hemingway. So I
Wow.
think he's run out of good writers, so he's now down a little lower on the rung
Just
of the ladder, and
scraping the bottom of
he's
the barrel.
scraping the battle,
Man,
the bottom of the barrel, looking
well,
at me. So right now, you and I share a common. Well, he's not a common publisher.
no,
He's an excellent
uncommonly.
publisher.
Right. Yeah.
We share a publisher, um, Anxiety Press.
Yes.
And for my money, right now, Anxiety Press is kind of like where Black Sparrow was 30 years ago,
I would agree. And Cornell West
and
would
where
agree too.
City Lights
Right.
was 50 years ago.
Yes.
So I've had four books published by Anxiety Press, and I think you've had two.
Well, a forthcoming River of Stars with collaboration with Yang Bo Ma in China, and he's my Chinese translator, and I wrote the foreword to Gale Wolf by G.R. Tomini. So that's coming out
Wow,
next week.
that's
Yeah,
really good.
thank you.
And Cody is Cody Sexton's the
So Cody
publisher.
Sexton. Yeah.
Really good guy. I have all the respect for him in the world. And I make it a point, most, and it pisses me off to no end, that most writers think that their work of being a writer stops the minute their book is out. And I look at it completely differently. I strongly feel that these publishers are very often spending money that they could ill afford to put boneheads like me into print. So I take it as my charge to go out and make sure that my books sell for these people who put their life and their living on the line for me. So my two newest Anxiety Press titles are Captain Beefheart Never Licked My Decals Off Baby and Don't Shoot the Messenger, Just Give Him a Good Place to Hide.
Great title.
Uh, thank you. Uh, the Captain Beefheart book that just came out 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Um, it's roughly a discussion of the classic 1968 Captain Beefheart album, Trout Mask Replica. But more than that, it's an excuse for me to use talking about that book as a way to go off and talk about myself.
Of
Uh,
course.
that's
That's why
my
we're
way
here.
of
That's
of
why we're here.
of
That's why you're here. Yeah.
segueing into a memoir of sorts. And I talk about how the 60s and the music of that time influenced me and shaped me. You and I talked about uh, what's his name? Darby Slick and Jerry
Darby,
Slick.
Darby Slick and Jerry Slick. Yeah. Brothers. Yeah.
And those people and their involvement with the rock group Great Society, which became the Jefferson Airplane, which
Yes.
had an offshoot to be Hot Tuna.
Right.
And in this book, I talk about attending a 1969 concert by Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna, and I talk about that in there. But for me, being a writer is basically getting a chance to talk about yourself and memorialize the really neat, interesting, and memorable people I've run into over the years. That's really my main goal. Um, Another thing that Anxiety Press did for me, and I don't mean to monopolize the
No, no, no,
conversation.
please, please. This is all fascinating. And I'm complicit in the, you know, your promotion of anxiety press is, you know, it's very compatible with my promotion of myself. So, right.
Well, hey, I was talking about my book,
Yes.
The Street.
Street. Yeah, which is a great title.
Well,
A great
it's
title.
interesting because
It sounds
The
very
Street.
gritty, my man. It sounds very
Well,
like
thank you.
hardcore and gritty.
Um,
Is it? Is it gritty?
Gritty in a coal miner sense of the word,
Oh,
but let me
grit,
back
as in
up.
your eyes and your
As in dirt.
tiger arms, and yes.
Let me back up. The Street comprises two slim memoirs. Uh, they were called Memory Lane and RMA. They were published separately, and they both take place on the street, which is the street where I grew up. And one book looks down the street in one direction, and the second book looked up the street in the other direction and talked
Yes.
about the people, places, and things that I remember as a child growing up in a coal mining community less than wealthy. In any case, those books were published by a Canadian publisher several years ago. COVID hit, and one thing led to another, and like many small businesses, that publisher went out of business. Fast forward another year and a half later, Cody and I hooked up, and he had the balls to suggest that he put those two books back into print, and we combined them into one volume called The Street. And I'm really, really proud of this book. This is on Amazon, and I hope people will pick it up and support Cody.
Yes. Yes, I can definitely endorse supporting Cody and supporting, I need to mention, Greg Tomani, GR Tomani, who is the senior editor of Anxiety Press, the one who brought me on board and who's I wrote the foreword to his book Gale Wolf, which is the first. It was actually a republication with my foreword. It's the first openly queer epic poem in history. And while we were talking, we were mentioning rock and roll legends, right? And we are talking about the '60s and talking about some of the classic bands and that were in and around Woodstock and certainly with my family connection to, excuse me, people like the founder of Joy of Cooking. Who I keep forgetting her name, but she's still a close friend of my dad's. As
Was her name Myers?
no,
Uh,
it was she started with Tony Brown, and it was on they were on Capitol Records, and they were pretty famous group. They played out with the Dead and Starship or Airplane and Jimmy and all those bands. And she used to routinely play with Johnny Lee Hooker and Big Mama Thornton. So but but I was going to mention, and I'm very proud of my association with Lemmy Kilmister. Lemmy Kilmister, best known to his millions of fans worldwide as the front man for two bands. Well, actually, he was in the band Hawkwind, which is a Canadian band, and he was fired for drug abuse, which, considering that these people were acid freaks, it's very, very ironic. Also, he was arrested at the Canadian border for coke, and they let him go because it was speed. So Lemmy, among other things, he would always say, "This is, it says to Alex, you-hoo, Lemmy," right? He would always say, this is the slipcase to Motorhead's March or Die. um, um, uh, album, and contains the song Hellraiser, which he collaborated with one Ozzy Osbourne. And anyway, so Lemmy, among other things, he would always say, "I remember before there was rock and roll," because he was a friend of the Beatles, and he he talks about this in his autobiography, Lemmy, the Autobiography. And he was also a roadie for Jimi Hendrix. So he's the guy
Hmm.
who hooked up Jimmy with acid, basically. So like he would give Jimmy, seven hits, and Jimmy would throw him back three, and they'd get, totally toasty together. So can only imagine. So anyway, but I think somebody like Lemmy was somebody who was kind of like the connective part of the connective tissue between before he also invented heavy metal, and it was before Lemmy there was rock and roll. That was rock and roll started around what I mean. You were around. I wasn't born. My dad, talked about going to see Chubby Checker, I think, or Fats Domino. But so tell us about sort of your earliest rock and roll experiences. Like what was it like back in first back in like the day, like in the 50s, and then what was it like in the 60s when things really started to get cooking, man?
Well, my first rock and roll memory is seeing Buddy Holly on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Wow.
I can
Buddy
remember that.
Holly.
And I remember thinking, how this guy looks like a geek. And the
Right?
word geek wasn't even invented back then, but
Yeah,
he looked like one of us. And
right.
I thought, if he could do that, we could do that. And
Exactly.
I have no rhythm, no musical talent, but he was the first one I remember. And then going into the 60s, which again, my book, Captain Beefheart Never Licked My Decals Off, baby. Um,
Great
the book
title.
is set smack dab in the middle of the 60s. And I remember uh Ry Cooder uh Ry Cooder opened up for Beefheart in the thing I write the concert I write about in the book. And then Beefheart came and tore it up, and half the people in the hall had no clue what Beefheart was doing, which was fine for him because he was just doing his thing. He was just totally focused about his art. And when it was over, when the concert was over, people were screaming, "More, more," and walked off the stage. Beefheart walked back on. They put one spotlight on him. The place got quiet, and Beefheart whistled the song More. Remember, more than the greatest love?
Yeah.
He whistled that song, didn't say a word, whistled the song, turned around and walked off stage. And the place went nuts. They didn't know what to make of it, what to do. And I thought, that's art. For me, that was just like one of the coolest moments I ever saw anybody do. And he just pulled it out of his butt and gave it to him.
Yeah.
Uh, they, that was subversive. And then you fast forward to people like the Velvet Underground and those
Yes.
kind of
Thank you. Thank you.
and Nico. Uh,
Actually, I have a couple. I mean, I don't mean to jump on you, but I have some really cool anecdotes about like Nico and Velvet Underground, and I was friends with Betty Cronstadt, who is the wife of Lou Reed. And
uh-huh.
as a matter of fact, she liked my Lou Reed poem that I wrote about him. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like
No.
Betty
There's a
Cronstadt,
brand
man.
new book out called
Yeah.
Warhol's Muses,
Yes.
and it talks about people like Oh, I can't think of all the women, but Nico was one of them
Yeah.
who were in that whole Warhol milieu. And hey, I used milieu in a sentence. How cool is that?
Milieu. Yes, like a milieu order bride, right?
Very good. Or that
Thank you.
meal you had last night was not as good as we thought.
Yeah, but so yeah, so I have a friend named Carrie Lee Crum, and as you probably know, as I've talked about, I can't help. One of the things I always say about Nocturnicorn books is we're literary and literal rock stars that we have on our roster. And so Carrie Lee Crum created this band, little known band, called the Runaways when she was 14 years old. And this is true story as anybody who knows anything about rock and roll knows. Runaways were one of the most influential bands in rock and roll history, as is Bauhaus and whatever Joy Division. But um, so she told me this story about how when she was Danny Sugarman, who wrote he was the guy who was he was like 12 years old when he was the manager for the Doors. Writes about it, and he also wrote the book No One Here Gets Out Alive.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
So okay, I mean it is known, and as a matter of fact, I'm publishing her in The Junk Merchants 2, a literary tribute to William S. Burroughs. I'm actually publishing for the first time ever her a a classic sort of true junkie story that she tells. So she's been very open, public about her struggles, and so she was telling me this story about how she and Nico, where she was visiting with Nico and Nick at her apartment in Hollywood, and also Jerry Danny Sugarman was there, the rock writer and who wrote, among other things, Wonderland Avenue, right? And so they were getting high, man. But and then the next day, and they were speaking French, and they were being very weird about it. They were saying they're referring to Carrie as sort of like, oh, isn't she exquisite? She's like a young boy, And so Carrie doesn't speak French, and she was asking Danny Sugarman is like, what are you guys talking about? And she says, yeah, we were, Nico said you're like a young boy, and it's very almost classically depraved, right? It's like it sounds so decadent, you know. And then the next day, because I think that Carrie had been, who is, bisexual, had been dating one of the Go-Go's. I think was dating the early drummer for the Go-Go's, and they just broken up. And so Nico, um, kind of famously and this wasn't a very nice thing to do, but she dedicated Femme Fatale to to
Ah,
to Carrie, who was right there. So that's my Nico story.
wow. Well, for anybody who doesn't know Nico, get I think the name of the album is called Chelsea Girls.
Yes,
Um, and the song Chelsea Girls is just one of my all-time favorites.
right?
That's high on my list. Now, we talked about me preparing for this, and uh, I really didn't want to read anything. I just wanted to talk, but talk always leads me back into the poetry. And if I can I just I picked a whole bunch of stuff, but I wanted to just at random read two things if
That's
I
why we're,
can.
we're we're having you here. Yeah, to
Okay.
whatever you like,
Um,
whatever you like to do, sir. I mean, this is
while we were
a real
talking, I
honor for,
flipped
for me.
through this book, which is my Don't Shoot the Messenger book.
Yeah,
And my poems are almost like anti-poems. Uh, they're little snapshots. They're meant to work on two levels. One where you get an immediate I, and then later on when you're sitting on the toilet and you think back and you go, Holy God, that's what he meant. I want them to work on two levels. Uh, Let me read two real quick ones just
Yeah,
to.
by all means.
He was broke, not out of money broke, but out of options broke. Sarah was gone. The kids wanted nothing to do with his sorry old ass, and the rent was over 3 months late. Still, it was Christmas. So before he did anything else, he put the lights out, put up the tree, covered it all with gas, and sat back and watched it burn.
Oh my gosh. Hey, you wouldn't happen to be a fan of one Richard Brautigan, would you? Because
Oh yeah, sure. Good.
because
Trout fishing in America?
you ever read his book The Hawkline Monster? This is a gothic
Yes.
western. Yeah, man. He's great. I mean, my dad introduced me to trout fishing in America, and always been one of, we should have you on the show with Ellen Mabey. I mean, she's a friend of and collaborator with Jackson Brown. She's really beloved by rock and rollers. So, and she's
Yeah,
totally into Velvet
I'd
Underground.
love I'd love to do it. I'd love to
Okay.
do it. We should talk about scheduling.
Yes.
Um, Let me read one from my book, 24 Poems.
Okay. Great.
This was published by Meat for Tea Press a couple years ago. Um, the cover photo, those glasses, I was doing a reading in a Barnes and Noble. And I just got those glasses that morning. The glasses didn't fit. They were skewed on my face like this. And
Right.
there happened to be a photographer shopping in the thing.
Oh
He
wow.
he stumbled on the reading there, and I'm reading, and here's this guy going in and out and taking pictures, and he introduced himself to me later on, and we he ended up sharing some of the photographs, and that ended up coming out on the cover of this book. In any case, most of my poems are about either people I ran into, people I made up because I lie a lot, and people I knew when I was a kid. And here's one from my book, 24 Poems, brought out by Meat for Tea Press. TJ thought he was tough, and he was. And he was also a good 6 inches taller than me. But I caught him off guard when I lunged at him on the bus stop after school. We were maybe 17, and he'd already been scouted by the Mets, so that should tell you how big he was. But like I said, I caught him off guard and smothered him in punches and pushed him up against the side of the bus and kept on punching and punching until he had enough. And I stood back with sweat and tears and dirt and snot running down my face. And I walked onto the bus feeling a good 6 feet taller than I actually was. And when I got to my seat and looked out the window, that creepy son of a bitch was still on the ground with his blonde hair covered in dirt
Oh my
and a
gosh.
great big surprised look on his face. He never made it to the Mets, and I never won another fight again.
Oh my God. Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. You know, who's uh, uh into that's kind of very very intense sports. Sandy DeLuca is my collaborator in Providence, Rhode Island. We wrote Thunderstruck, a dark poetry collection together with Aaliyah Celeste Williams, and she was actually a wrestling journalist. So she interviewed all the big wrestling people back in the day. So she's about your age. So she's very shy about reticent about being on my show, but and she's having some health difficulties. But I think you and Sandy, maybe I could put you to in touch with by email because I think you would have a lot in common. She loves like Fleetwood Mac and she wrote some poems about like Stevie Nicks and stuff. She loves Stevie Nicks.
You talked about wrestling.
Yes.
Uh, I I grew up watching the original superstars of wrestling. Guys like Gorgeous
I
George,
was gonna say because my dad talks about Gorgeous George, right? Yeah.
Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan says he he reveres or revered Gorgeous George. He remembered Gorgeous George walking through a hotel lobby and looking him in the eye. And for Bob Dylan, that was a great, great moment. Now, Gorgeous George was a massive guy with this blonde hair that he combed straight back. And for some reason, he reminded me of Jerry Lee Lewis,
Yeah, man.
that kind of attitude. And I remember one time seeing Jerry Lee Lewis,
Wow.
and
You
I
saw the
wrote about
killer? You
this
saw
at
the
the time.
killer. Damn.
Lewis Lewis in an interview, I saw him, and he was talking. I don't know if he was drunk or sober or what, but it doesn't matter. He held up his left hand to the camera and said, "You see that? That there's rock and roll." That made my
Ah,
day.
ah, yeah. Like was a yeah, I always aver to Lemmy. So Lemmy was a well known for collecting Nazi memorabilia. He was not a Nazi, he just liked it. He liked their stuff. He's a World War II historian. And
Hmm.
his friend Keith Emerson was in a band called The Nice.
Emerson, Lake, and Palmer.
Yes, before Emerson, Lake and Palmer, he was in a band called The Nice, and that's when he started.
Yeah.
Lemmy gave him these Hitler Youth daggers. They would Keith was very well known for taking these daggers and sticking them in his keyboards, right? So he'd play a chord and he would stick the dagger in his keyboards like that, you know. And that was
Uh,
what not everybody is aware is those were Lemmy's daggers that he got from well, one of my best friends for more than a quarter of a century was his publicist and PA, and we're no longer talking, but that's another story. But she would we I really got the inside scoop besides having met him and her dad. She was adopted, and so her dad was a soldier in World War II, and he actually took these ripped these medals off of Nazi soldiers, and so she would basically take them and like give them to Lemmy for his collection. He even had a Christmas card signed by Hitler. That's how big he was into World War because also his dad was a captain in the RAF. So that's hence songs like Bomber and it's really historical value
yeah.
as well.
Now he's dead now, isn't he,
Yeah, he
Lemmy?
died unfortunately, but not tragically because he lived his full life. I mean, he was the consummate, and there's going to be I believe it's a Netflix documentary about him called Born to Raise Hell, which
Uh,
is which is coming up next year, I believe. And he was just a consummate rock and roller. I mean, he drank 2 bottles of bourbon every day. He did massive amounts of amphetamines, and chain smoked like a fiend. But he was never not coherent.
um, we're you were asking about the things that inform my poetry,
Yes.
and animals, dogs specifically, take a big place in my poetry. I talk about my wife, I talk about the people I remember, and I talk about the dogs in my life. I'll get to my point in a minute,
Oh,
Uh,
please go ahead. Yeah.
my book, Five
Oh,
Dogs.
wow. Could you hold that up a little more because I want to take a screenshot because that's great. And that's something that you have in common with our mutual friend Mish Murphy, who is actually um the one who introduced us. Yeah.
Well, the dog on the cover of this, Mish did a painting of,
Oh, wow.
and that was turned into a poster, which she signed and numbered and sold. Um, in any case, I had a book several years ago called Bark, which was a collection of my poems about the dogs I've known. And when I switched over to Concrete Mist Press after Epic Rights Press went belly up after COVID, uh, he talked me into writing a book about the dogs in my life. Concrete Heath Brocker at Mist Press. Um, and I wrote this poem, and there's a story behind this poem, and I'll tell you the story after I read the poem. It's it's only 4 pages long, which makes it probably the longest poem I ever wrote in my life. Um, since I'm kind of known for being a minimalist of
Right.
sorts. But this one had to be a little bit of a longer poem, and it's a true story, and I'll tell you the story afterwards.
Okay.
And all the sick, perverted bastards of the world deserve to die an awful, bloody death. I was picking my dog up at the vet today, and while I was waiting for them to bring her out, I looked over at the big white dog on my right, and I was shocked to see that it had an ear missing, and part of its skull was gone. It looked like an old wound to me that had healed over, and I nodded at the owner, and I asked, "Hey man, what happened to your dog? She get hit by a car?" "Nah," he said. "She's a rescue." "Rescue?" "Yeah, we found her out in the road, thrown out, with her ear gone and her head half torn away." "Holy shit, man, what happened?" "Well, the cops said they see it all the time. They figure she was raised by people who fight pit bulls.
Oh, no.
And you could tell by looking at her that she's really sweet. And I guess when she wouldn't fight, she was probably just used." "Used for what?" "Bait."
Oh, no.
Either one of us said a word. I knelt down and I gave that dog a hug and I scratched her neck.
Oh,
And when I did, she turned real quick and gave me a great big, wet, sloppy kiss right on the face. And all the sick, perverted bastards of the world deserve to die an awful, bloody death.
that's so beautiful. That's so beautiful.
And that's a true story. Now, the fall, excuse me, the follow up to that poem is after that got published, that became one of my biggest poems at that point in time. After it was published, I got a call from a friend who said, "Hey, John, go on the ASPCA website. There's a poem you got to read. I know how you love dogs. You got to read this poem." That was my poem without my name on it, but it was put up on
Holy
the
shit.
ASPCA website. So then
Congratulations.
the poem ends up being in my book, Bark. And then 2 months after that, I'm downstairs in the kitchen doing something in the kitchen, and I hear Kathy from upstairs, Kathy, my wife,
Yes.
upstairs saying, "John, John, come here, quick." And I thought, oh man, what happened? We took a break, fall, I don't know. I run upstairs and she's pointing at the TV. "Look at that." And there on the Oprah Winfrey show was that dog that I wrote about
Oh
in
my
that.
God.
The dog's name I found out was Oogie. And
Oogie.
since then, Oogie has had books written about him. but I'm proud to say I was the first one to ever write about Oogie.
That is
That was my poem
incredible.
about Oogie.
You know, this is going to sound like I'm like there was a character on SNL, remember, who was played by Kristen Wiig, who's named Penelope.
Oh,
I don't,
I love her.
yeah, right? And I don't know if you remember this ongoing sketch, but she was always like whoever she was talking to, she would have to one up them. And so, so she's talking to somebody who's talking about they went to see a baseball game, they went to see the Dodgers, whatever, and then she says, "Yeah, I invented baseball," and right, and well, so because of my peculiar history, I wind up being that guy or that I wind up being Penelope. So I apologize in advance for the story, which is not an attempt to one up you, but it's just I too.
Sharing information.
I too have was associated with a famous dog who was also you know um talked about on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And that dog was named Lady. And it was a dog that was in common between my friend Tom Sullivan, the actor and musician and memoirist of books like If You Could See What I Hear, right? And I also edited his book, Seeing Lessons, 14 Life Secrets I've Learned Along the Way, right?
Yeah,
Now, see, how I met Tom was that I worked for his boutique secretarial service. I was a senior secretary for this firm in Torrance, California called Electronic Data Associates, or EDA. And it was run by this very conservative woman named Marge Judge. She was very nice. Her husband, I forget his first name. He died. I believe Marge is still around. And despite the fact that, I'm liberal AF and she's very, very Republican, we got along famously, and I certainly, and I it was sort of like Cheers, it was like I would walk in and everybody would say, "Hey, Alex," and and the other people would walk in, and our front office woman was this beautiful black, African American lady from Columbus, Missouri, right? And she was very old school. She'd been the secretary to the president of USC. Right. And so our clients were, among others, Betty White and Tom Sullivan, right? Tom Sullivan would call in routinely. He would give his transcription. He found out that I was a writer, that I'd already published. At that point, I believe it was around the same time, shortly, yeah, that I published work in like Penguin Random House anthologies and so forth, right? And I was already established journalist for magazines like Metal Hammer magazine and Metal Maniacs, and I that's when I first interviewed Lemmy. And to get to my point is that so Tom said, "Hey, you're a writer, and so I bet you always wanted to write for Playboy too." And I said, "Yeah," and he said, "Good, that's good." And I said, You know, I told him that I had a learning disability. He said, "That's great," that he was blind since birth, right? So he he and Betty White, who was another client of ours, shared this sort of whatever support animal named Lady. And I think it was that either Tom inherited it her from Betty or vice versa. At least they had this dog in common. So Lady was the dog that was, talked about on when after or around. So look up um, uh, uh, Seeing Lessons by Tom Sullivan, and the that in the acknowledgments page he says that to my friend Alex who edited this book and was very patient with me and very candid. And so I'm certainly very, very honored to have had that opportunity. And that it's many years later, I kind of paying it forward by promoting other authors and It's interesting about Nocturnicorn books is we have the age range is from 80 years old with Maxim Jakubowski in England, right? And then our youngest author is Jade Thomas, who's 15 years old. Who's the
Wow.
of the dark fiction master Jeffrey Thomas. And you're about the same age as Jeffrey. So he had children late, and also Sandy DeLuca, my collaborator. So it's really beautiful that there's a multi-generational aspect.
Well, I'm 70. I'm 74 right now, and I just sitting here preparing for a show, talking with people like you. Ideas, bounce back and forth, and you and I could talk all day about these things and these people and things we know. Um, I just really do appreciate getting the chance to talk with you and share ideas.
Absolutely.
And I know our time is running short, and I got the chance to read two
Yeah,
poems and show the covers of my books. So I really am happy with what we pulled off here. But one final thing before we go, and um, people ask right up front, you talked about how I've published nearly 4,000 poems,
that's true.
and sounds impressive. I get that. Yeah, I understand that. But the impressive part to me is that I've been consistent. I've endured. Um, if you do the math, that 4,000 poems or whatever the exact number is, and I do have the exact number here somewhere, but if you do the math, it works out to over the course of my 55 years doing this to about a poem published every 2 weeks. Now, anybody, especially a bonehead like me, can do that as long as they stay focused and have a thick skin and keep on doing the work. That's the part that I like, being able to endure, to go out and do the work. And yesterday morning, when you and I talked yesterday, I wrote 7 very short poems. And individually, reading poems is a pain in the ass, and it's hard to do, and I don't like doing it, especially with very short things that work probably best on the page and need to be looked at, like Carlos Williams' Wheelbarrow.
Right.
But I've got 7 very short ones, all put together, and let me read them, and maybe they'll work together and maybe they won't, but at least it'll give me a way to close our conversation and
Can
get
can I
off stage.
could
Go
I, could
ahead.
I just interject one thing? After you read, I want to actually close off with something not mine, but I'll surprise you.
Very good. I'm looking
Okay.
forward to it. 7 really quick ones with no rhyme or reason or link between them. He dreamed he was a god, but the dead dog on the side of the road knew better. First, Rooney died, then Belmonte, and now the only ones left are me and you and a hawk and a mouse. At 74, I forget almost all of it, but I never will forget you. Stella dog, on the couch in the morning sun, you already know it all, don't you? We had what all the others hoped to have, and we still do. The last thing he said to me, don't ever be the knot, always be the rope. The road is not the path. That's my
Yeah,
7 short poems.
that's very
Surprising.
Okay,
Surprise.
so well, there's one other thing actually because I didn't have a chance to tell you, but one of the projects that we're working on, which are I'm compiling, it's called A Collective Paw, the anthology, because our sub imprint of Nocturnicorn Books is a collective paw, and that is from a phrase from a poem by Ellen Mabie, which is called A Whiff of Wonder, which is in the Neurospicy collection that just came out. Neurospicy, a defiantly different anthology. And so, as actually suggested to us by our that we put in that we do a collective paw, the anthology by our good friend and frequent collaborator Nicole H. Six, who, among other things, is the daughter of the musician Nikki Six from Motley Crue. She's very, very, in her own right, she's quite distinguished. And so I would love to have you, John, on board with a collective paw because the whole entire concept is it's not necessarily all about animals, but it is about animals. And it's to raise consciousness and awareness that we're not the only species that
Hmm.
on the planet that's important and valuable and certainly animals take care of us, at least as much as we take care of them. In fact, they're very symbiotic with us, and especially dogs.
Oh,
My
yeah.
my dog, I'll never forget. I had this dog named Trolley Dogs, and it was kind of this mutt. He was like kind of uh, a black lab, and he was a corgi, and he was this, and he was that, and he was just the most amazing. He looked like this this kind of a black lab that had been cut off at the knees, then he turned into a basset hound. So it's like looking at this guy, and he was a sweet, noble animal, wouldn't hurt a fly, but man, did he have a bark on him. He had this loud bark. He sounded ferocious. He was traumatized by cats, and I should do some trolley poems because he is a real sweetheart. And and I remember when I was having a real downtime because the woman I was living with, where I owned trolley with, was a real piece of work, and so I was on the couch again once again, and so trolley sensed that I was feeling down about myself, and so he reached out with his paw, and he started petting me. And
Oh.
when your dog pets you, you're in bad shape, right? It was like I was like, "Oh, you pet me. Oh, you sweetie pie, right?" Oh, so I'm a huge animal lover, and so I think you would be perfect for a collective paw, the anthology. So
I'd
all
very much like to be a
these
part
would
of it. You and
like
I could talk later in the week.
go
I'd love
to
to.
um animal animal rights you know um 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 organizations. And so I thought I would surprise everybody by doing something I like because I was an English professor and I sort of like to reintroduce the classics to people who may have been I think most of the time when people encounter authors um, like, for example, William Shakespeare, that they're intimidated because they think, oh, that first I'm never going to understand Shakespeare and it's elevated, it's too high for me. It's a high diction or whatever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read first I'm going to give you in a nutshell, which is a pun, what this poem is about. And I'm going to be a little bit crude, but this is exactly what it's about. Okay, this is from the Sonnets by William Shakespeare. Okay, this is the most famous poet in English literature. This is about coming, as in, coming, as in like you have sex with a woman or a man or whatever. Hopefully, you keep it interspecies, and And then you're like, damn, man, I just came and it was great, but what now? And then you're looking at the person and the beer goggles wear off and you're like, yikes. So you make your excuses and you pack your stuff and you drive away or whatever. So this is what that's all it's about. This is all this poem. It's sonnet number 129 by William Shakespeare. Yeah, the William Shakespeare, right? The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action, and till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed, no sooner but despised, out despised straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had uh, past reason hated as a swallowed bait on purpose laid to make the taker mad, made in pursuit and in possession, so had, having, in quest to have, extreme, because you want that pussy or whatever. Sorry, it's crude. A bliss and proof, and proved a very woe. Before, a joy proposed, behind, a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell.
You read well.
Thank you.
You read
William
well.
Shakespeare.
I look forward to working with you on that Paw anthology, and
Yeah.
we could talk about that.
Okay.
And I really do hope that your viewers will go out and pick up some uh, anxiety press titles.
Yes.
Uh, Check out both of our books. And I really do appreciate you having me on the show. And anytime you want to do this stance again, all you got to do is say the word and I'll be there.
Okay, so brother, I will shoot over an email to you and Ellen maybe, and we'll just have you both because you're both wonderful poets and you're very much on the on the on the radar, I guess, of the right causes and in of the heart. So I really appreciate having you on the show, and we'll talk soon. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.